August 15, 1943, 20,000 feet above Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. The morning sun breaks through scattered clouds as 18 P-38 Lightning slice through the Pacific sky. Their twin engines hum in perfect synchronization. Below them, the dense jungle stretches endlessly toward the horizon. The pilots scan their instruments, unaware they're about to intercept the most important target of the Pacific War. In 90 seconds, Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, will be dead. The aircraft that makes it possible is unlike anything the world has ever seen. Twin engines mounted on twin booms, a central nacelle housing the pilot, tricycle landing gear when everyone else used tail draggers. It looked like something from a science fiction magazine, not a serious military weapon. Critics called it a designer's fantasy. Skeptics said it would never fly straight. But what the P-38 Lightning became would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. By late 1936, the world was accelerating toward catastrophe. Nazi Germany had remilitarized the Rhineland. Fascist Italy was conquering Ethiopia. Imperial Japan was tightening its grip on Manchuria. The Spanish Civil War was becoming a testing ground for new weapons and tactics. And in the skies above Spain, something terrifying was becoming clear. The age of the biplane was over. The United States Army Air Corps watched with growing alarm. Their pursuit aircraft were obsolete before they left the factory floor. The Boeing P-26 Peashooter, with its fixed landing gear and open cockpit, was hopelessly outclassed. European fighters were hitting 350 miles per hour. American fighters struggled to reach 240. The gap was widening every month. Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey understood the problem better than most. As the Air Corps Chief Fighter Projects Officer, he'd seen every disappointing prototype, every compromise, every design that prioritized cost over capability. The military needed a revolution, not an evolution. They needed an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything currently imagined. They needed it to carry heavier armament, and they needed it yesterday. In February 1937, the Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X608. The specifications seemed impossible. Top speed of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, endurance of 1 hour at full throttle, armament capable of destroying enemy bombers. The proposal was so demanding that most manufacturers didn't even bother responding. The technology simply didn't exist. But Lockheed Aircraft Corporation saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. The company was young, hungry, and built on innovation. They'd already proven themselves with revolutionary designs like the Electra transport. Now they wanted to prove they could build fighters. Chief Engineer Hall Hibbert assembled a small team in Burbank, California. Leading the design work was a brilliant, driven 23-year-old engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson looked at the specifications and saw a puzzle that could be solved if he was willing to abandon every conventional assumption about fighter design. Traditional single-engine layouts wouldn't generate enough power. But what if he used two engines? What if he mounted them on separate booms, leaving the center fuselage free for the pilot and weapons? What if he clustered all the guns in the nose, where they'd never need convergence adjustments? What if he used the newest innovation in landing gear, the tricycle configuration that eliminated ground loops and gave pilots better visibility? The concept was radical, it was risky. It violated decades of fighter design philosophy, but the math worked, the physics worked. On paper, it would exceed every requirement in Circular X608. But here's where it gets interesting. The Air Corps didn't just want an aircraft. They wanted a weapons system that could change the balance of power in the coming war. They wanted a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, intercept high-altitude raiders, and dominate dogfights from Europe to the Pacific. No aircraft in history had ever been asked to do all of that. The P-38 Lightning would either prove that American engineering could leap ahead of the world, or it would become the most expensive failure in Air Corps history. The real story was just beginning. To understand the P-38 Lightning, we need to go back to 1936, when American air power was dying. The numbers told a brutal story. Germany's Messerschmitt Bf-109 could reach 354 miles per hour. Britain's Supermarine Spitfire prototype was touching 350. Japan's Mitsubishi A-5M carrier fighter was hitting 273 miles per hour with remarkable maneuverability. Meanwhile, America's frontline fighter, the Boeing P-26 Peashooter, maxed out at 234 miles per hour. It had fixed landing gear, an open cockpit, and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns. Going into combat against modern European fighters would be suicide. The problem went deeper than speed. American fighters had pathetically short range. The P-26 could barely manage 360 miles before running dry. European nations could afford short-range fighters because they were defending compact territories. American strategic doctrine demanded something entirely different. The United States had vast distances to patrol, coastlines spanning 2 oceans, island territories scattered across the Pacific, and the growing certainty that any future war would require striking deep into enemy territory. The bomber theorists at Air Corps Tactical School had convinced leadership that strategic bombing would decide the next war. Waves of heavy bombers would devastate enemy industry, break civilian morale, and make ground invasions unnecessary. There was just one problem: bombers needed protection. British trials had already proven that even heavily armed bombers couldn't survive against determined fighter attacks. Without escort fighters, the bomber offensive would turn into a slaughter. But escort fighters didn't exist. No aircraft could match a bomber's range while maintaining the speed and agility needed for combat. The P-26 had neither the range nor the performance. The Curtiss P-36 Hawk, then entering production, was barely better. It could hit 300 miles per hour and had enclosed cockpit, but its range was still woefully inadequate. The Army needed a fighter that could accompany B-17 bombers on 1,000-mile missions into hostile territory. Then there was the altitude problem. New bomber designs were pushing toward 30,000 feet, where thinner air meant longer range and protection from anti-aircraft fire. Fighters needed to operate at those heights too, both to escort friendly bombers and intercept enemy raiders. But most fighters lost performance dramatically above 15,000 feet. Their engines gasped in the thin air. Their controls became sluggish. High-altitude interception was becoming the new battlefield, and America had nothing that could fight there effectively. The armament situation was equally dire. American fighters carried 2 or 4.30 caliber machine guns, weapons designed to shoot down fabric-covered biplanes. Modern aircraft had aluminum skin, armor plate protecting critical components, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Shooting them down required heavier weapons. The Germans were mounting 20 cannons. The British were clustering 8 machine guns in their new fighters. American designs were still using weapons that would barely scratch a modern bomber. Lieutenant Kelsey understood that incremental improvements wouldn't save American air power. The country needed a fighter that could leap an entire generation ahead, something that combined revolutionary speed, unprecedented range, high-altitude performance, and devastating firepower. It needed to be ready before the war started, because once the shooting began, there'd be no time to catch up. The consequences of failure were existential. Without adequate fighters, American bombers would be massacred. Without air superiority, amphibious invasions would be impossible. Without long-range interceptors, enemy bombers could strike American territories with impunity. The next war would be won or lost in the air, and America was bringing obsolete weapons to a modern fight. But the solution would come from an unexpected place. A small California company with a 23-year-old genius who was about to rewrite the rules of fighter design. Enter Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson. 23 years old, brilliant, abrasive, impatient with mediocrity. Johnson had joined Lockheed straight out of the University of Michigan, where he'd already made a name for himself by telling a visiting Lockheed team their new Model 10 Electra had serious tail stability problems. He was right. Instead of being offended, Lockheed hired him. Now, barely 3 years later, he was being handed the most important fighter project in America. Johnson's design philosophy was brutal in its simplicity: strip away everything unnecessary, solve problems with elegance rather than complexity, and never compromise performance for convenience. When he looked at Circular X608's requirements, he didn't see impossibility. He saw a clean engineering problem waiting for an unconventional solution. The single-engine approach was dead on arrival. No existing engine could generate enough power to meet the speed requirements while carrying the fuel load needed for extended range. 2 engines meant doubled power, but it also meant doubled weight, drag, and complexity. Every previous twin-engine fighter had been a lumbering disappointment, heavy, slow, and outclassed by nimble single-engine opponents. Johnson's breakthrough came from inverting the traditional layout. Instead of mounting 2 engines on a central fuselage, he split the aircraft into 3 components. 2 booms would each house an Allison V-1710 engine and landing gear. Between them, a sleek central nacelle would hold the pilot, weapons, and nose gear. The twin booms would extend rearward to support a horizontal stabilizer connecting them. From above, the aircraft would look like a trident. The advantages cascaded through the design. Mounting all guns in the nose eliminated the convergence problem that plagued wing-mounted weapons, where bullets from different guns crossed at only one specific range. Every gun would point exactly where the pilot aimed, from point-blank to maximum range. The central nacelle could be kept small and aerodynamic, reducing drag. The twin-boom configuration provided redundancy. If one engine failed, the other could bring the pilot home. The tricycle landing gear eliminated ground loops and gave pilots clear forward visibility during takeoff and landing. But here's where it gets interesting. The design created as many problems as it solved. The long booms and connecting stabilizer created torsional stress issues. The counter-rotating propellers required complex engineering to prevent torque-induced rolling. The turbo superchargers needed to maintain high-altitude performance generated tremendous heat. The complex cooling system for two engines required extensive ducting. And the entire aircraft had to be strong enough to withstand combat damage while remaining light enough to meet the speed requirements. Johnson worked obsessively through the spring of 1937. His team at Lockheed's Burbank facility ran thousands of calculations. They built scale models and tested them in wind tunnels at the California Institute of Technology. The numbers kept coming back positive. The unconventional layout actually produced less drag than traditional designs. The distributed weight improved stability. The twin-engine configuration provided redundancy without sacrificing agility. On June 23, 1937, Lockheed submitted their proposal to the Air Corps. They promised an aircraft capable of 400 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, 40 miles per hour faster than required. They claimed it could reach that altitude in 6 minutes. They projected a range of over 1,000 miles. The armament would be devastating: 123 Madsen cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, all nose-mounted. The Air Corps Review Board was skeptical. The design looked like something from Flash Gordon serials, not a serious military weapon. Twin booms, tricycle gear, a 23-year-old designer making promises that veteran engineers said were impossible. But Lieutenant Kelsey championed the proposal. He understood that conventional thinking had produced conventional failures. Revolutionary requirements demanded revolutionary solutions. On June 23, 1937, Lockheed received a contract for a single prototype. The designation was XB-38. The budget was $163,000, roughly $3.4 million in today's money. Johnson had 18 months to build an aircraft that would either validate his genius or destroy his career. However, what happened during the first test flight would shock everyone involved and nearly kill the pilot who flew it. The first XB-38 took to the skies on January 27, 1939. Lockheed test pilot Lieutenant Ben Kelsey, the same officer who'd championed the design, climbed into the cramped cockpit at March Field, California. The aircraft gleaming before him was unlike anything that had ever flown. Polished aluminum skin. Twin Allison engines producing 1,150 horsepower each. Those distinctive twin booms extending back to a connecting tail. 27 feet of wingspan carrying 13,500 pounds of revolutionary engineering. Kelsey advanced the throttles. The counter-rotating propellers bit into the morning air. The tricycle landing gear made the takeoff run smoother than any tail dragger he'd ever flown. At 90 miles per hour, he pulled back on the yoke. The XB-38 lifted cleanly into the California sky. No drama, no surprises. It flew exactly as Kelly Johnson's calculations predicted. Over the next 2 weeks, Kelsey pushed the prototype through increasingly aggressive tests. The aircraft exceeded 400 miles per hour in level flight, making it the fastest aircraft in America. It climbed like nothing he'd ever experienced. The handling was responsive, almost eager. The twin-engine configuration provided reassuring redundancy. The nose-mounted armament would be devastatingly accurate. Everything worked. The Air Corps was impressed enough to order 13 more prototypes for evaluation. But they wanted proof that this radical design could handle transcontinental flight, the kind of range that would make it a true strategic weapon. On February 11, 1939, Kelsey was ordered to fly the XB-38 from California to Wright Field, Ohio, in a record-breaking speed run. The flight would demonstrate range, reliability, and performance to skeptical generals. Kelsey departed March Field at 10:00 a.m. The twin Allisons roared as he climbed to altitude and turned east. Kansas passed below. Missouri, Illinois. He was averaging over 350 miles per hour, unheard of for a cross-country flight. The aircraft performed flawlessly. 7 hours and 2 refueling stops later, he approached Mitchell Field in New York, having flown coast to coast in record time. The landing approach looked perfect. Then disaster struck. As Kelsey descended through 2,000 feet, both engines quit, fuel exhaustion. The rapid descent had caused the carburetor floats to block fuel flow, a problem no one had anticipated. Suddenly, he was piloting 13,500 pounds of powerless metal over Long Island. He had seconds to react. The golf course at Mitchell Field appeared below. Kelsey aimed for the fairway, dropped the landing gear, and committed to a dead-stick landing. The XB-38 hit hard. The nose gear collapsed. The aircraft skidded across the grass, tearing itself apart. Metal shrieked. Debris scattered. When the wreckage finally stopped, Kelsey kicked open the canopy and scrambled clear. He was bruised but alive. The XB-38, the only flying example of America's most advanced fighter, was destroyed. Most programs would have died right there. A crashed prototype, millions in losses, critics sharpening their knives, but the flight data told a story that transcended the accident. The XB-38 had just flown coast to coast at speeds no fighter had ever achieved. It had proven the design worked. The crash wasn't a design flaw, it was a fuel management problem that could be fixed. The Air Corps didn't cancel the program, they doubled down. The remaining 12 prototypes were redesigned as YP-38 service test aircraft. Johnson's team went back to work, addressing every lesson learned from the crash. They redesigned the fuel system. They strengthened the landing gear. They refined the engine cooling. They added armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. They replaced the troublesome 23 Madsen cannon with a 37 Oldsmobile autocannon and 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns. By September 1940, the first YP-38 was ready. Europe was already burning. The Battle of Britain was raging in the skies over England. Poland had fallen. France had collapsed. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands were under Nazi occupation. America's entry into the war was no longer a question of if, but when. And the military desperately needed fighters that could stand against the Luftwaffe's battle-hardened squadrons. The YP-38 test flights revealed an aircraft transformed. It was faster, 417 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, more reliable, better armed. The tricycle gear proved its worth again and again, making landings safer for inexperienced pilots. The concentrated nose armament eliminated the harmonization headaches plaguing other fighters. The range was extraordinary, over 1,100 miles with drop tanks. But its real test was about to come in actual combat, and the Lightning would face its trial by fire in the most demanding theater of World War II. August 9, 1942, 14,000 feet above the Aleutian Islands, Alaska. First Lieutenant Stanley Long scanned the gray Pacific horizon from his P-38E's cockpit. The 54th Fighter Squadron had been patrolling these desolate islands since Japanese forces seized Attu and Kiska 2 months earlier. It was miserable duty, constant fog, brutal cold, equipment failures in sub-zero temperatures. But today, the weather had cleared just enough to reveal something in the distance. 2 Kawanishi H-6K flying boats, lumbering through the air like fat geese. Long pushed his throttles forward. The twin Allisons responded instantly. His wingman, 2nd Lieutenant Elza Shahan, stayed tight on his wing. The Japanese pilots spotted them too late. Long lined up on the lead aircraft, watching it grow larger in his gun sight. At 200 yards, he pressed the trigger. The 37 cannon thumped. 4.50 caliber machine guns hammered. Shells tore into the flying boat's fuselage and wings. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away. Smoke poured from one engine. The Kawanishi rolled, inverted, and plunged toward the Pacific. Shahan took the second aircraft. His fire was equally devastating. The flying boat staggered, tried to climb, then nosed over into a death dive. Both Japanese aircraft hit the water within seconds of each other. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. The P-38 Lightning had scored its first confirmed aerial victories of World War II. But the Aleutians were a sideshow. The real test was coming in North Africa, where American forces were preparing to enter the European War for the first time. The first fighter group, equipped with P-38FS, deployed to England in June 1942 before moving to North Africa for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa scheduled for November. The pilots were green. Most had never seen combat. Their training emphasized high-altitude interception tactics that would prove nearly useless in the North African theater, where engagements happened at low and medium altitudes. The Lightning itself was still evolving. Early models suffered from engine problems, turbocharger failures, and cockpit heating issues that left pilots numb with cold at altitude. November 19, 1942, Tunisia. The 1st and 14th Fighter Groups flew their first combat missions over North Africa. They escorted B-17 bombers attacking Axis airfields and shipping. German and Italian fighters rose to meet them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Mackay C-202s flown by veterans of 2 years of desert warfare. The Americans learned hard lessons immediately. The Lightning's twin-engine configuration made it easy to identify, but it also made inexperienced pilots hesitant to engage, fearing friendly fire incidents. The nose-mounted armament was devastatingly accurate when pilots could get into position, but the aircraft's large size made it less maneuverable in turning fights than the nimble Axis fighters. German pilots quickly learned to exploit this, forcing Lightnings into low-altitude dogfights where the P-38's advantages disappeared. Losses mounted. On November 28, the 1st Fighter Group lost 3 P-38s in a single engagement. On December 4, 4 more went down. The pilots were learning that textbook tactics didn't survive contact with experienced enemies. The Lightning could outrun anything the Germans had, but only if pilots maintained speed and altitude. Get slow and low, and the Bf-109 would tear you apart. December 2, 1942. Second Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey of the 94th Fighter Squadron spotted a formation of Junkers Ju-88 bombers escorted by Bf-109s near Bizerte. Instead of diving straight into the formation, a suicidal move, Ilfrey used the Lightning's speed advantage. He climbed above the German fighters, built up speed in a dive, then slashed through the formation in a high-speed pass. His concentrated nose armament destroyed one Ju-88 before the escorts could react. He used his excess speed to zoom back to altitude, beyond the Messerschmitt's reach. It was the tactic that would define P-38 combat operations: boom and zoom. Use altitude and speed as weapons. Never get slow, never turn with enemy fighters. Strike hard and fast, then escape before the enemy can respond. Pilots who learned this survived. Those who tried traditional dogfighting tactics died. By January 1943, the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups were finding their rhythm. They'd learned to use the Lightning's strengths: phenomenal speed, devastating firepower, and extraordinary range. They'd learned to avoid turning fights. They'd learned that 2 engines meant you could absorb damage that would kill a single-engine fighter and still make it home. The kill ratios began to improve. The Lightning was proving it could fight if flown correctly. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement its legendary status in the most demanding theater of the entire war, the vast, unforgiving Pacific. By mid-1943, the P-38 Lightning was at the height of its power, and nowhere was this more evident than in the Pacific theater. The vast distances of the Pacific were tailor-made for the Lightning's capabilities. Island-hopping campaigns required fighters that could escort bombers on 1,000-mile missions, strafe ground targets, and still have fuel to dogfight on the way home. Single-engine fighters like the P-40 Warhawk simply couldn't do it. The P-38 could. Its twin engines provided redundancy over shark-infested waters where a single-engine failure meant certain death. Its range was unmatched. Its firepower could shred Japanese aircraft in seconds. The 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific became the Lightning's spiritual home. General George Kenney, commander of Allied Air Forces under Douglas MacArthur, recognized the P-38's potential immediately. He pulled strings to get more Lightnings shipped to his theater, often at the expense of units in Europe. His pilots would prove him right. April 18, 1943, Operation Vengeance. This was the mission that would make the P-38 immortal. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the combined fleet, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect forward bases. The Americans had his exact itinerary, his exact flight path, his exact timing. Major John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron was given an impossible task: intercept Yamamoto's transport 400 miles from base over enemy-held territory with split-second timing. No other aircraft in the American arsenal could do it. Mitchell selected 18 P-38s and 16 of his best pilots. They'd fly at wave-top height to avoid radar, navigate by dead reckoning over open ocean, and climb to intercept altitude at precisely the right moment. The mission launched from Guadalcanal at 7:25 a.m. For 90 minutes, the P-38 skimmed across the Pacific at 50 feet, radio silence maintained, pilots checking their fuel gauges nervously. At 9:34 a.m., they spotted land, Bougainville Island, exactly where it should be. Mitchell's navigation had been perfect. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber broke away as the killer section. The other 16 P-38s climbed to engage the 6-0 escorts. At 9:43 a.m., Lanphier spotted two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers, Yamamoto's transport and its escort, descending toward Kahili Airfield. The Zeros saw them and dove to intercept. Lanphier broke left, drawing 3 Zeros after him. Barber went for the bombers, his .50 calibers and 20 cannon. The P-38G carried the improved Hispano cannon, tore into the first G-4M's right engine and fuselage. The bomber staggered, trailing smoke and debris. Yamamoto's pilot tried to run for the jungle. Barber fired again. The bomber's wing came apart. It plunged into the jungle and exploded. The second bomber tried to reach the airfield. Lieutenant Bespy Holmes riddled it with fire. It crashed into the ocean. Yamamoto was dead. The man who'd said he would run wild for 6 months after Pearl Harbor had been hunted down and killed in a precisely executed ambush. Japan would never recover from losing its most capable naval commander. However, the real story of the Lightning's dominance was being written by individual pilots across the Pacific. Major Richard Bong became America's top ace flying P-38s. He would eventually claim 40 confirmed kills, more than any other American pilot in history. His tactics were textbook Lightning: use altitude and speed, strike fast, never get into turning fights with the agile Zeros. Bong understood that the P-38 wasn't a dogfighter. It was an assassin. Major Thomas McGuire scored 38 kills in his P-38, named Pudgy. He perfected the art of deflection shooting, leading targets to account for their movement, a skill made possible by the Lightning's stable gun platform and concentrated nose armament. His marksmanship was legendary. He could destroy enemy aircraft with short, precise bursts that conserved ammunition and maximized lethality. Captain Charles MacDonald racked up 27 kills and pioneered low-altitude strafing techniques. He'd learned that the P-38's rugged construction could absorb ground fire that would shred lighter fighters. He'd dive on Japanese airfields at dawn, destroying aircraft on the ground before they could scramble. His unofficial motto became the Lightning pilot's creed: speed is life, altitude is life insurance. The statistics from the Pacific told the story. By late 1943, P-38 units were achieving kill ratios of 5:1 or better against Japanese fighters. The 5th Air Force's 475th Fighter Group, flying exclusively P-38s, would eventually claim over 550 aerial victories, more than any other fighter group in the Pacific. The Lightning accounted for more Japanese aircraft destroyed than any other Allied fighter in the theater. But the aircraft's versatility extended beyond air-to-air combat. P-38s flew photo reconnaissance missions deep into enemy territory, their speed and altitude capability making them nearly impossible to intercept. They served as pathfinders for bomber formations, using their long range to guide attacks against distant targets. They strafed shipping, destroyed locomotives, and bombed bridges. But every legend has its darkest moment, and for the P-38, that moment was coming in the frozen skies over Europe. Despite its success in the Pacific, the P-38 Lightning wasn't invincible, and the brutal skies over Europe were about to prove it. European theater exposed problems that the Pacific had masked. At 25,000 feet over Germany, where bomber escorts fought in sub-zero temperatures, the Lightning's Allison engines began failing catastrophically. The V-1710 engines lacked the high-altitude performance of the supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlins powering British Spitfires and the new P-51 Mustangs. The turbo superchargers that were supposed to solve this problem became maintenance nightmares in the extreme cold. Worse, the cockpit heating system was woefully inadequate. Pilots flying 4-hour missions at altitude suffered frostbite despite wearing every layer of clothing they could fit into the cramped nacelle. Instrument panels frosted over. Gun mechanisms froze. Pilots' hands went numb on the controls. Some missions saw P-38s returning with pilots so incapacitated by cold that ground crews had to lift them bodily from their cockpits. The engines developed a terrifying problem called compressibility. In high-speed dives, the Lightning's primary tactical advantage, the aircraft would hit a speed where the controls locked up completely. The nose would tuck under, the dive would steepen, and pilots found themselves trapped in uncontrollable plunges toward the Earth. Some recovered at dangerously low altitudes, others didn't. The phenomenon wouldn't be fully understood until after the war. The P-38 was encountering the sound barrier's effects before anyone knew what that meant. What happened next shocked the 8th Air Force Command. German pilots adapted quickly to the Lightning's weaknesses. Luftwaffe veterans learned to force P-38s into low-altitude turning fights where the aircraft's size and weight became fatal disadvantages. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 could out-turn, out-roll, and out-climb the Lightning below 15,000 feet. German pilots would bait American formations down, then pounce with numerical superiority. January 1944. The WWII Fighter Command recorded devastating losses. On January 11th, the 55th Fighter Group lost 10 P-38s in a single mission, over 25% of the group's strength. On January 29th, another 8 went down. The Lightnings were being slaughtered by German fighters that could operate effectively at any altitude, in any weather, without the crippling mechanical problems plaguing the American twin-engine fighters. Pilot morale plummeted. Some units began referring to the P-38 as the flying coffin. The twin-boom configuration, which provided redundancy in the Pacific, became a liability over Europe. German pilots could identify Lightnings from miles away and concentrate their attacks. The distinctive silhouette that had once been an advantage now painted targets on American pilots. The twin-engine design also created vulnerability to battle damage. A single 20mm cannon shell hitting the central nacelle could sever control cables running to both booms, leaving the pilot helpless. Fuel fires in either engine could quickly spread to the center section. Several pilots died when damaged P-38s broke apart in midair, the twin-boom structure failing under combat stress. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force was transitioning rapidly to P-51 Mustangs. The single-engine fighter had better high-altitude performance, longer range with drop tanks, and none of the cold weather problems plaguing the Lightning. P-38 groups were re-equipped squadron by squadron. Some pilots were relieved. Others felt they were abandoning an aircraft that simply hadn't been given a fair chance. Yet one mission would prove why this aircraft earned its place in history, and it would happen in the most unlikely theater of all. August 10, 1944, Southern France, Operation Dragoon. While the world's attention focused on the Normandy breakout 400 miles to the north, the largest airborne and amphibious assault in Mediterranean history was about to unfold along the French Riviera. Over 1,000 Allied aircraft would support the invasion. Among them, the first fighter group's P-38s had drawn one of the most critical missions of the war, flying top cover for the invasion fleet while simultaneously attacking German positions inland. Captain Arthur Hayden of the 27th Fighter Squadron lifted off from Corsica at 5:47 a.m. Behind him, 35 more P-38 Lightnings formed up in the pre-dawn darkness. Their mission brief was brutally simple: destroy anything that threatened the invasion force. German fighters, coastal batteries, troop concentrations, railroad bridges, communications towers, everything. The Lightnings crossed the Mediterranean at 8,000 feet. Below them, the invasion armada stretched to the horizon, over 1,370 ships carrying 151,000 troops. The naval bombardment had already begun. Flashes of orange fire rippled along the coastline as battleship guns pounded German defenses. Smoke rose in thick columns from Nice to Toulon. At 8:03 a.m., Hayden's radar controller reported bandits inbound. A mixed formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s attempting to strafe the landing beaches. 16 German fighters diving toward the most concentrated collection of Allied shipping in the Mediterranean. If they reached the transport ships, the casualties would be catastrophic. Hayden rolled inverted and dove. His squadron followed in perfect formation. The Lightning's speed advantage was overwhelming. They caught the German formation at 4,000 feet, still 2 miles from the beaches. Hayden selected the lead FW-190 and opened fire at 400 yards. His 4.50 calibers and single 20mm cannon converged in a cone of destruction. The Focke-Wulf's engine exploded. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. The sky erupted into chaos. P-38s and German fighters tangled in a swirling dogfight above the invasion fleet. Lieutenant James Morris destroyed a Bf-109 that was lining up on a landing craft packed with infantry. Captain William Sloan shot down two FW-190s in 40 seconds, both pilots ejecting over the beaches and immediately being captured by advancing American troops. The German attack collapsed. Of the 16 fighters that attempted to reach the fleet, 11 were shot down. The remaining 5 fled inland, jettisoning their bombs over empty countryside. Not a single ship was damaged, not a single landing craft hit. The P-38s had created an impenetrable shield over the most vulnerable moment of the invasion. But here's where things took a dramatic turn. With the German air threat eliminated, Haydn's squadron pushed inland. Their secondary objective was the Rhone Valley Railroad Bridge at Livron-sur-Drôme, a critical chokepoint for German reinforcements heading toward the invasion beaches. Intelligence reported heavy anti-aircraft defenses protecting the bridge. Previous attempts to destroy it with high-altitude bombing had failed. Haydn took his flight down to 500 feet. At that altitude, the Lightning's nose-mounted guns could be used with devastating accuracy. The bridge appeared through the morning haze, stone arches spanning the river, German troops visible on both banks. Anti-aircraft tracers began rising toward the approaching fighters. The P-38 screamed across the bridge at 350 miles per hour. Haydn and his wingmen concentrated their fire on the northern support structure. The 20 explosive rounds tore into stone and steel. Chunks of masonry tumbled into the river below. 2 more P-38s attacked the southern span. The combined firepower, 8.50 caliber machine guns and 420 cannons hitting the same target simultaneously, proved too much for the aging stone construction. A section of the northern span collapsed into the Rhone with a tremendous splash. The bridge wasn't completely destroyed, but it was unusable for heavy vehicles. German reinforcements would have to detour 50 miles east, adding crucial hours to their response time. Hours that Allied forces used to consolidate their beachhead and push inland. The 1st Fighter Group flew 114 sorties on that first day of Operation Dragoon. They claimed 18 confirmed kills, destroyed 12 locomotives, knocked out 7 railroad bridges, and silenced countless anti-aircraft positions. They lost 1 P-38, the pilot bailing out safely and walking back to Allied lines 2 days later. Operation Dragoon succeeded beyond expectations. Within 2 weeks, Allied forces had liberated most of southern France. The P-38s of the Mediterranean theater had proven that the Lightning, when employed correctly with proper tactics and maintenance, remained a war-winning weapon. As the war progressed, the Lightning would continue to evolve, adapting to new roles and proving its versatility in ways its designers never imagined. By late 1944, warfare was changing, and the P-38 Lightning evolved with it. Lockheed's engineers had never stopped refining the design. Each new variant addressed problems discovered in combat while expanding the aircraft's capabilities. The P-38J, introduced in August 1943, featured enlarged radiators that finally solved the chronic engine overheating problems. Hydraulically boosted ailerons improved roll rate, a critical deficiency that had cost lives in dogfights. The cockpit heating system was completely redesigned, ending the frostbite epidemic that had plagued European operations. The P-38L, which began reaching squadrons in June 1944, represented the Lightning's final and most capable form. More powerful engines, 475 horsepower Allison V1710-111s, pushed top speed to 443 miles per hour. 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets could be mounted under the wings, transforming the fighter into a devastating ground attack platform. Improved fuel systems extended range to 2,600 miles with drop tanks, enough to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, though by then P-51 Mustangs had largely taken over that mission. But the Lightning found new purpose in roles that played to its unique strengths. The twin-engine configuration and spacious central nacelle made it ideal for adaptation. The F-5 Photo reconnaissance variant, stripped of armament and fitted with cameras, became the most important intelligence-gathering platform of the war. Flying alone and unarmed at 40,000 feet, F-5 pilots photographed everything from D-Day beaches to Ploesti oil fields to Tokyo Harbor. Captain Karl Polifka of the 27th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron flew an F-5 deeper into German territory than any Allied aircraft had ventured. all the way to Berlin in September 1944, before the first American bombs fell on the Reich capital. He returned with crystal-clear photographs of industrial targets, railroad yards, and defensive positions. His single mission provided intelligence that shaped bombing campaigns for the next 6 months. The P-38's ground attack capabilities became increasingly important as Allied forces pushed into Germany. Fighter bombers carrying two 1,000-pound bombs could strike with precision impossible for high-altitude bombers. P-38s destroyed bridges, ammunition dumps, and German jet aircraft on the ground before they could take off. The concentrated nose armament proved devastating against locomotives. Pilots could fire down the length of a train, destroying engine, fuel car, and munitions cars in a single pass. In the Pacific, the Lightning's evolution took different paths. The P-38M night fighter variant, introduced in early 1945, featured an AN/APS-6 radar mounted in an external pod beneath the nose and a second crew member, a radar operator, seated behind the pilot in an extended canopy. Only about 80 were produced, but they scored kills against Japanese aircraft attempting night raids on Allied bases. The concept was revolutionary, a high-performance fighter adapted for all-weather, around-the-clock operations. Pilots continued refining tactics throughout 1944 and 1945. In the Pacific, P-38 units perfected skip bombing, approaching Japanese ships at wave-top height and releasing bombs that skipped across the water like flat stones, detonating against hull plates below the waterline. This technique proved devastatingly effective against Japanese coastal shipping. The Lightning's ruggedness allowed it to survive the intense anti-aircraft fire encountered during these low-altitude attacks. By war's end, Lockheed had produced 10,037 P-38s in all variants. The production lines at Burbank, California, and a second facility in Dallas, Texas, operated around the clock. At peak production in 1944, Lockheed was completing 18 P-38s per day. The aircraft that had seemed like an impossible gamble in 1937 had become one of America's most produced fighters. Different variants served different needs. The P-38J-25 incorporated dive flaps that finally solved the compressibility problems that had killed so many pilots in uncontrollable dives. The system was simple, electrically operated flaps under the wings that deployed during high-speed descents, disrupting airflow and preventing the control lockup that occurred when approaching the speed of sound. Pilots called them dive recovery flaps and credited them with saving countless lives. Photographic reconnaissance, F-5s flew missions over Japan itself, photographing cities before and after firebombing raids, documenting damage, and selecting new targets. These missions were suicidal, lone aircraft deep in enemy territory without armament, relying entirely on altitude and speed for survival. F-5 pilots became some of the most decorated airmen of the war despite never firing a shot in anger. In China, P-38s of the 449th Fighter Squadron flew missions with Chinese-American composite wing, training Chinese pilots while striking Japanese supply lines. In Burma, Lightnings provided air cover for Merrill's Marauders and other special operations units pushing through the jungle. In Italy, they flew close air support missions for troops grinding through mountain warfare in the Apennines. The versatility that Kelly Johnson had designed into the airframe in 1937 was proving its worth. The P-38 could do everything: air superiority, bomber escort, ground attack, photo reconnaissance, night fighting, and maritime patrol. Few aircraft in history have been adapted to so many different roles while maintaining effectiveness in all of them. And then came the moment that would define its legacy forever, the final missions that proved the Lightning's place in aviation history. When the war ended in 1945, the P-38 Lightning had written itself into history with blood, fuel, and victory. The final combat missions varied across theaters. In Europe, P-38s flew ground attack sorties against retreating German columns until May 8, 1945, VE Day. Pilots strafed Wehrmacht convoys fleeing toward Austria, destroyed the last functional locomotives in Bavaria, and provided air cover for concentration camp liberations. The last German aircraft shot down by an 8th Air Force P-38 fell on May 4th, a Junkers Ju-52 transport attempting to evacuate Nazi officials from Salzburg. In the Pacific, Lightning operations continued right up to August 15, 1945, VJ Day. The final aerial victory credited to a P-38 occurred on August 12th, when Captain William Shomo of the 82nd Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron destroyed a Japanese fighter during a photo reconnaissance mission over Kyushu. 3 days later, the Emperor's surrender broadcast ended the war. P-38s that had been preparing for the invasion of Japan were suddenly flying victory rolls over Tokyo Bay instead. The numbers told the story of the Lightning's contribution. Over 10,000 P-38s had been built in 7 years. They'd flown hundreds of thousands of combat sorties across every theater of the war. In the Pacific, P-38 pilots claimed over 1,800 Japanese aircraft destroyed, more than any other Allied fighter type. The top 2 American aces of all time, Richard Bong with 40 kills and Thomas McGuire with 38, both flew P-38s exclusively. In the Mediterranean and European theaters, Lightnings claimed over 1,400 German and Italian aircraft destroyed. They'd flown 130,000 combat sorties, dropped 19,000 tons of bombs, and fired 10 million rounds of ammunition. The F-5 reconnaissance variants had photographed virtually every strategic target in Nazi-occupied Europe, providing intelligence that shaped the entire Allied bombing campaign. But what happened after the war was equally remarkable. Most P-38s were scrapped almost immediately. With wartime production ended, the military had no need for thousands of fighters. By 1946, only a few hundred remained in service with Air National Guard units. The twin-engine configuration made the Lightning expensive to operate compared to single-engine jets that were rapidly entering service. The future belonged to the P-80 Shooting Star, and soon after, to supersonic jet fighters that made propeller-driven aircraft obsolete overnight. Yet some Lightnings found new lives in unexpected places. Honduras purchased 26 P-38s in 1948 and operated them until 1965, 2 decades after World War II ended, making the Honduran Air Force the last military operator of the Lightning. Italy received 75 P-38s under post-war aid programs and flew them into the 1950s. China received over 100 during the Civil War between nationalist and communist forces. A handful of P-38s were converted for civilian use. Aerial survey companies stripped out armament and installed cameras for mapping operations. Several were modified into 2-seat trainers or executive transports. The spacious central nacelle accommodated a second seat behind the pilot. One served as a flying test bed for turbocharger research well into the 1950s. The photo reconnaissance F-5 variants proved so capable that the Air Force continued operating them after the war. They flew mapping missions over undeveloped regions of Alaska, Canada, and South America. Their high-altitude performance and long range made them ideal for cartographic work. The last F-5 in military service wasn't retired until 1949, 4 years after the war's end. Today, fewer than 10 P-38s remain airworthy worldwide. Another 24 survive in museums, carefully preserved as monuments to one of World War II's most distinctive aircraft. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum displays a P-38J that flew combat missions in the Pacific. The Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California, maintains a flyable P-38 that performs at airshows, its twin Allisons still roaring as they did 80 years ago. Every year, thousands of people watch these surviving Lightnings fly. The distinctive twin-boom silhouette is unmistakable. The sound of counter-rotating propellers is unforgettable. For veterans who flew them, the sight brings back memories, some painful, some proud, all indelible. Looking back, the P-38 Lightning was far more than just a machine. It was proof that American innovation could transform the impossible into reality. Looking back, the P-38 Lightning was more than just a machine. It was a revolution that arrived exactly when America needed it most. The technological innovations Kelly Johnson packed into that radical twin-boom design rippled through aviation history for decades. The tricycle landing gear that skeptics mocked in 1937 became standard on virtually every aircraft built after 1945. The concentrated nose armament concept influenced jet fighter design through the Korean War and beyond. The twin-boom configuration reappeared in the Northrop P-61 Black Widow night fighter, and decades later, in the scaled composites Rutan Voyager that flew non-stop around the world. But the Lightning's greatest contribution was strategic. It gave America a fighter that could operate at distances impossible for any competitor. While German and Japanese fighters were limited to defensive operations within a few hundred miles of their bases, P-38s ranged across entire oceans and continents. That range made island-hopping campaigns possible in the Pacific. It allowed deep penetration reconnaissance over Europe. It enabled the destruction of enemy assets far behind front lines. The aircraft proved that unconventional thinking could solve seemingly impossible problems. When the Army Air Corps demanded a fighter with revolutionary performance in 1937, conventional designers said it couldn't be done. Kelly Johnson ignored convention and created something entirely new. His willingness to challenge assumptions, to mount two engines on separate booms, to cluster all guns in the nose, to use tricycle gear when everyone else used tail draggers, demonstrated that innovation requires courage as much as engineering skill. The Lightning also demonstrated American industrial capability. From a single experimental prototype in 1939 to over 10,000 production aircraft by 1945, Lockheed transformed a radical concept into a war-winning weapons system in just 6 years. The production lines at Burbank employed thousands of workers, many of them women who'd never worked in factories before. They built aircraft that flew from Alaska to Australia, from North Africa to the Philippines, from the Aleutians to southern France. Perhaps most importantly, the P-38 proved that twin-engine fighters could succeed in air combat. Every previous attempt had failed, heavy, slow, and outmatched by nimble single-engine opponents. The Lightning shattered that paradigm by being faster than single-engine fighters, more heavily armed, and capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy smaller aircraft. It demonstrated that properly designed twin-engine fighters offered capabilities that single-engine designs simply couldn't match. The men who flew it understood its significance. Richard Bong called it the finest fighter plane ever built. Charles Lindbergh, who flew P-38 combat missions as a civilian technical advisor in 1944, praised its handling and performance. Thomas McGuire said it made him feel invincible, until the day it didn't, when he was killed attempting a low-altitude turn to protect a wingman. The P-38 Lightning earned its place in history not through perfection, but through versatility, innovation, and the courage of the pilots who flew it into harm's way. So there you have it, the complete story of the P-38 Lightning. From Kelly Johnson's revolutionary design in 1937 to the final combat missions over Japan in 1945, this aircraft proved that American ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. It was the fighter that killed Yamamoto, the platform that made Richard Bong and Thomas McGuire into legends, the reconnaissance bird that photographed Hitler's Europe, the ground attack weapon that destroyed thousands of enemy vehicles, trains, and ships. 10,037 P-38s were built across all variants. They flew over 130,000 combat sorties in Europe alone and claimed more than 3,200 enemy aircraft destroyed across all theaters. The Lightning achieved kill ratios exceeding 5, one in the Pacific, and proved that twin-engine fighters could dominate when flown with proper tactics. It remains one of the most distinctive, innovative, and successful combat aircraft ever designed. From the frozen Aleutians to the blazing deserts of North Africa, from the jungles of New Guinea to the skies over Berlin, the P-38 Lightning proved that unconventional solutions to impossible problems can change the course of history. What impressed you most about this legendary warbird? The revolutionary twin-boom design, the incredible range that made Pacific operations possible, the devastating firepower that could shred enemy aircraft in seconds? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into World War II's greatest aircraft, the bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes that decided the war in the air, subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are dozens more stories like this waiting to be told. Thanks for watching WWII Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.